Let's do this!
Did you know? There's some interesting foreshadowing hidden in the opening cutscene of Xenoblade Chronicles. During this close-up shot of the Bionis' face, you might notice what appears to be birds flying around the Bionis. However, if we zoom in, you can see that these aren't avian, but are in fact Telethia, telepathic antagonistic creatures that the player doesn't normally come into contact with until many hours into the game. These Telethia appear in every version of the game, although they're most noticeable in the Definitive Edition's intro or in the Wii version while using a hacked camera. They're fully modeled and high poly, but the game never zooms in far enough for players to see them clearly. They're even in the new 3DS version of the game, though they're even harder to see here due to the 3DS's tiny and low-resolution screen. DidYouKnowGaming teamed up with dataminers and Xenoblade enthusiasts to bring you a slew of interesting and lesser-known facts about the original Xenoblade Chronicles, so sit back and relax as we take a deep dive into the Wii's most impressive RPG. The idea for the game's world to take place atop two battling titans frozen in place actually came from nowhere in particular. According to the game's executive director and writer Tetsuya Takahashi, the idea of two massive gods duking it out just popped into his head while he was waiting for a train. In Takahashi's own words, you know the expression "to be enlightened" when an idea just pops into your mind? It felt like different ideas I'd had came together and formed a clear concept. Takahashi knew that some ideas are hard to precisely convey using spoken word, so he decided to create a model to help illustrate his idea. He'd even get young developers working at Monolith Soft to pose for him as a reference as he sculpted the Titans. The model on your screen right now is what Takahashi created in July 2006, 4 years before the game's release and months before the Nintendo Wii hit store shelves. From here, Takahashi and his team would decide how the game would function and which part of each Titan would be useful for different scenarios. Takahashi elaborated in an Iwata Asks interview. The young staff members weren't just posing so that we could model the gods on them, we were also trying to determine what each pose would offer us in terms of fields of play for an RPG. For instance, if the god's leg was stuck out, the upper leg could be used as a plane, or the section of the back which the sun shines on could be a jungle, and conversely, the section shaded from the sun could be an Arctic area, and so on. Around this time, the idea that the gods would house two warring factions came about, as well as the idea to focus the game on visions, with the hero being able to see the future. Takahashi saw potential in these ideas, and thanks to Monolith's close relationship with Nintendo, he was able to take the project to Nintendo producer Hitoshi Yamagami. Yamagami in turn brought in Genki Yokota and Yurie Hattori from Nintendo Software Planning and Development, with Hattori recently finishing her work writing the scenario for Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. With a set of intriguing ideas and some key support, the developers got to work creating a prototype in April 2007. The concept of the protagonist seeing the future may have started in the game's story, but the game's designers felt it'd be weird if characters could only see the future in cutscenes without it impacting the gameplay, so the concept was worked into the combat. At first, the team experimented by putting this future sight ability into a turn-based RPG system, but with limited success. The team were big fans of the Final Fantasy series, with several devs even working on a handful of core Final Fantasy titles, but Takahashi believed that Final Fantasy was a series that had put too much emphasis on story and not enough on gameplay. To strive for a better balance in Xenoblade Chronicles, the team tried a more action-oriented battle system, and things started falling into place. But Final Fantasy wasn't the only retro RPG to impact Xenoblade's development, and the history of Monolith Soft is tied to the creation of Xenoblade itself. 1998's PlayStation title Xenogears, which started the Xeno saga, had its own impact on Xenoblade. Although the game was made by Square, several members of the team at Square's Development Division 3 would ultimately form the core of Monolith Soft, and the decisions made during Xenogears development would go on to have a profound impact on the skill set of Monolith's developers. Due to the limited power of the PS1, developers often had to choose whether they would use 2D characters in a 3D environment or 3D characters in a 2D environment. Final Fantasy VII went with 3D characters, and Xenogears went with 3D environments. Takahashi believes that because their team was one of the first to go all in on 3D backgrounds, developers such as Yasuyuki Hone, who was the art director for for Xenogears, ultimately became far more proficient at imagining and creating 3D environments. So when the time came to create Xenoblade, Hone and other artists were years ahead of the competition in terms of experience in bringing 3D worlds to life. Monolith Soft was founded in 1999 after the release of Xenogears, and their first move was to continue the Xeno universe with Xenosaga. But the studio was newly formed with limited staff and resources, and most of their programmers and designers were new to the industry. This led to issues during production, like the graphics engine only being finished 6 months before the game's deadline, and the entire team believed they wouldn't be able to create their ideal game. Where Xenogears received universal acclaim, the Xenosaga trilogy had a far more mixed reception. Takahashi described this result as mortifying, but the team resolved to do better, and told themselves that the next time they made a new Xeno title, it needed to stand out and be truly enjoyable. However, the development of Xenoblade Chronicles wouldn't be straightforward either. The game was set to be a Wii title, but the Nintendo Wii was so new that they didn't even know who their target audience would be. To make Xenoblade appeal to a wider audience, Monolith had many brainstorming sessions involving every member of the company. They ultimately decided to focus on creating a world that they'd want to live in themselves, and reflected on which elements they'd need to achieve this. And although the path before them seemed daunting, they did have one thing going for them. Monolith already had experience developing for the Wii with Disaster: Day of Crisis, and as soon as work on Disaster wrapped up, the staff working on it shifted over to help with Xenoblade's development. Their work on Disaster also gave them some insight into how to use the Wii remote, and they opted to use its functions sparingly in favor of more traditional controls. Now that Xenoblade had Monolith's full attention, they aimed to have the game ready for a Christmas 2009 release. The team put substantial effort into the game's world, but weren't able to truly fulfill their goals. Takahashi in particular wished they could have made the game's world seamless, with far fewer loading screens, and the team as a whole wanted to make it so players could go to literally any location on screen. One area of the map the team didn't have time to implement was the left shoulder of the Bionis. They'd even made a test map for it that can still be found in the Wii game's data. Eventually, this area would find its way into the game's definitive edition on Switch and become the setting for the epilogue story Future Connected. And this isn't the only unused content in the game. Exclusively in the Japanese Wii version of the game, there's an archive named Work that contains unused code and art assets. It was removed from Xenoblade's North American and European releases and isn't actually used by the game's code at any point. Inside the Work archive are 2 peculiar files that correspond to an unused Knight character. They're labeled 9 and 10 and contain his models and animations respectively. The knight in question has metallic armor, blonde hair, unusual golden eyes, and fights with a sword and shield. We have a few clues as to this knight character's identity and purpose. In Xenoblade Chronicles, each playable character has an ID value that the game uses to identify them. Since Shulk is the main character, he's player character ID number 1, and all of Shulk's models are appropriately all labeled PC1. The knight character has a file name of PC2. In the final game, Rein's files are labeled PC2. Fiora's models are called PC3, and so on and so forth. If we look at this pattern, it means this knight character may be a prototype design for Rein, or may have been a different character that was meant to exist in Rein's place. However, it's also very possible that the knight is just a dummy with a coincidentally similar file name to our favorite red-headed himbo. Unfortunately, there's no way to know for certain. The textures for the knight specify that he wields a short sword, and he has 9 animations. This character was previously and incorrectly labeled as Lambert due to the text Lambert appearing in his files, but as it turns out, Lambert is a type of 3D model lighting, not a name, and the string appears all over the game code, not just in this one character's files. Xenoblade's story has additional elements that were left on the cutting room floor. The game's scenario writer Yuichiro Takeda originally wanted to have one of the hero's allies become the enemy you face at the end. Takeda said, "When I floated this idea to Takahashi-san, he thought it'd be pretty galling in a game if an ally you had been through all sorts of adventures with and constantly worked on building up their experience ended up leaving your party and becoming your enemy." As such, the team ultimately avoided using this kind of betrayal in the game's story. They wanted to make sure that Shulk would be a hero who isn't hated, and noticed that that the protagonists in RPGs tend to be disliked, especially if they're not a silent protagonist. After all, if a character is supposed to be an avatar for the player, and the character acts in a way that the player never would, the player can become resentful of them. And although Shulk was quite vocal, he tested very positively with focus groups. As we mentioned earlier, Yurie Hattori had been brought on to help with the scenario writing, and her inclusion on the team turned out to be invaluable. Thanks to Hattori, several parts of the story were altered to be less jarring. According to Takahashi, one issue pointed out by Hattori-san that I can clearly remember concerns the girl named Fiora, the childhood friend of Shulk. There's a scene where she's fast asleep and you touch her hand. This was initially a scene where Shulk touched her cheek to communicate his feelings for her, but Hattori-san pointed out that suddenly touching a woman's cheek while she's asleep could be construed as being a little creepy. Hattori felt this might spoil the innocent and naive nature of the character's love, and a touch of the cheek was changed to a touch of the hand. Hattori also helped rework the game's ending to be more easily understood. The game was first shown off at E3 2009, but the team was nowhere near finished, and their holiday 2009 goal quickly became impossible. Debugging the game alone took 6 months, and many of the game's elements, such as combat, took far longer to perfect than expected. The game was revealed with the title MONADO, Beginning of the World. In the reveal, you can see that Shulk and Fiora had very different designs, and you can even see debug text in the interface where battle arts would later be put. But that's not all. There's a Xenoblade Chronicles Wii press file that contains a hidden, older version of the game's cover art. Compare it with the final version here. Notably, the Bionis' model looks a lot rougher and appears to be rendered directly on the version used in the game, the Mechon's shell is using an in-game model, and the hill is more at an angle. In the final version, the Mechonis and the Mechon shell are using unique high-poly models made specifically for this cover. Early in Xenoblade's development, the game's musicians were all composing in their own unique styles for each area. Despite their efforts to unify the game's music into one cohesive sound, the audio remained a problem. To overcome this fragmentation, the game's musicians would actually go to each other's homes, sit down together, and compose music collaboratively and make an effort to duplicate each other's setups for making music. One of the game's composers, Manami Kiyota, even learned a new set of software to match her colleagues. The game's music uses a wide range of instruments to avoid sounding monotonous, and each track was purposely made long so that it wouldn't repeat often while the player explored the game's world. The game's composers were initially reluctant to make such long tracks, but they ultimately came around. Recording all the game's voice acting was no simple feat either. According to the game's cinematics director Norihiro Takami, staff who were recording the game's voice work didn't go home for 10 days. Takahashi recalled, "We had so many lines that even if we did a very long recording session, you'd still feel that you had so much more left to do. But then when I brought what we'd recorded back to the office and handed it to the person in charge, I'd say, 'We went to the trouble of recording all of these lines, so you'd better use them. Failure is not an option.' But then, when all of this content was actually put in the game, some people thought that the characters were talking too much and that it was annoying. So at the very end, I had that adjusted. In all, Xenoblade Chronicles ended up having about 3,000 lines of recorded dialogue, but many of the battle lines went unused. Some of the more interesting ones feature characters crying out for their companions after they fall in battle. Presumably, these lines were dropped due to how dramatic and long they are, as they'd eventually become grating.
No way! Dunban!
Ricky! 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 Shulk! It can't be!
Another notable unused voice line has Shulk saying,
I'll risk it!
This is near the voice files for Shaker Edge and Stream Edge, so it's likely this was intended to be used as an alternate line for Battle Soul. A bit of a risky move that reduces Shulk's health in exchange for increasing the fullness of the party gauge. Unique lines for Shulk, Fiora, and Rein battling inside Tephra Cave exist too. These were meant for the quest where the trio picks up ether cylinders in Colony 9 at the beginning of the game, as Fiora and Rein directly reference a line about not hurting Shulk, something specifically said during the Tephra Cave quest. These lines were likely intended for after a battle, depending on how well each of the 3 party members did.
See? I told you Shulk wouldn't get a scratch.
Don't go on about it.
Looks like you're my guardian angel, Fiora.
Not looks like. I am. What were you saying about Shulk not getting a scratch?
I know. Sorry. Fiora,
It looks like you're my guardian angel.
Not looks like, I am.
Oddly, these Tephra Cave lines were not used in the definitive edition either. The game's audio was definitely impressive for a game that released over a decade ago, using 44.1 kHz audio. Most Wii and GameCube games used lower quality audio to save space, as at the time, disk space was quite limited. For reference, the standard audio quality for Nintendo Switch titles is 48 kHz, not far ahead of Xenoblade on Wii. Another way the game made good use of resources is how it displayed flashbacks and visions. The Wii has a meager amount of RAM, only 88 megabytes, and certainly couldn't load multiple large maps at the same time, so when Xenoblade flashes back to a past or to a future event, it uses a flat 2D picture of the background. This fools the player into thinking the game is loading the entire area, when it's in fact only loading an image. And because the flashbacks and visions have heavy filter effects on them, most players never even realize. Speaking of the Wii's file size limit, the Japanese version of Xenoblade Chronicles on Wii has a file size of around 4 GB, but the US and European versions have a file size of about 6 GB. That's an increase of 2 GB. The reason for this is not just the additional voice acting, but also because of the way the game itself is coded. Believe it or not, every character model in the game was duplicated. In the international release of Xenoblade, almost every character's animation and model is stored inside the game files twice. The reason for this is due to the English voice acting. The voice recordings for NPCs and enemies are stored inside the same file as their character models, so when the English dialogue was recorded, these files were duplicated and the English voices were injected into one set of the files. Since the English game's code for the models and animations were still pointing to the old Japanese files, it was easier to just leave them be than to rewrite how the game finds and reads those files. Then the code for the English voices simply points to the new duplicated files, and since the original files are untouched, Western players can also choose to play the game with Japanese voiceover. In Definitive Edition, the character voices are stored separately from the character models, meaning that the character models are not redundantly duplicated on Switch. There's also test models of every playable character wearing dummy outfits hidden inside Xenoblade on Wii. These are the only iterations of the models that are fully assembled. Normally, Xenoblade characters are stored separately by armor parts and not in one assembled model, as the player can mix and match armor items. Shulk, Dunban, and Ricky are naked under their dummy materials, but they don't have any visible bits. Fiora's Ham's reference model is unique, and has her hairstyle from the very first public trailer of Xenoblade. Unsurprisingly, Xenoblade Chronicles 3D has some interesting elements too. The game has two kinds of cutscenes: storyboarded cutscenes using dynamic camera angles and elaborate scripted events with unique animations, and dialogue cutscenes which use existing in-game character animations like walking, and generally don't move them around too much. These have dialogue boxes on screen and prompt players to press A to advance the dialogue. This is actually why Meyneth doesn't move in Xenoblade Chronicles 3D's model viewer. She's only seen for one storyboarded cutscene with a dynamic non-looping animation, and as such, doesn't have any pre-existing animation for the developers to use. Thus, they made Meyneth's model static. Additionally, Lady Meyneth has an NPC model meant for dialogue cutscenes or regular gameplay use. Another tidbit is that her legs and underwear are fully modeled despite a burst of light covering her underwear up in the cutscene she appears in. These were of course later seen in the new 3DS model viewer, but are normally visible nowhere else in the game. For Xenoblade Chronicles 3D, the map geometry of the game was completely changed. According to an interview that Game Informer did with Monster Games, the talented team that ported Xenoblade and Donkey Kong Returns to the 3DS, the huge open worlds presented our biggest technical and artistic challenge. The views were so long that even the new Nintendo 3DS XL hardware could not render them correctly, and the performance was very slow at first. We had to design a new graphics engine with a custom visibility culling system and a complex level of detail system. As for the art assets, all of the worlds were rebuilt and optimized while keeping the same look and feel. Surprisingly, an indoor location, Agnaratha, was our toughest environment. The level had many places where the screen contained the highest polygon count in the entire game. Our artists and designers had to build that level several times to get it to finally perform well. Interestingly, Monster had previously tried to port the game to the standard 3DS, but it simply wasn't possible until more powerful hardware came along. And for those asking why didn't they just port the game to the Wii U, at the time Nintendo believed that portability and being able to view the game in 3D was a more intriguing proposition than simply improving the game's visuals. Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, on the other hand, runs on Xenoblade Chronicles 2's engine. If you have a keen eye, you may have noticed that the motion blur between the two games is identical. Additionally, the files inside the params folder are very similar, with 2 being shared from Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and 1 referencing blades, which are not really in Definitive Edition save for Alvis. Interestingly, all the Xenoblade games have files in their internal data relating to code names for the game itself. In Xenoblade Wii, this name is Kyojin, which means giant. In Xenoblade Chronicles 2, the code name is Big Folk 2, and in Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, the name is Big Folk Switch. Obviously, all of these refer to the Titans in said games. Humorously enough, the new 3DS port of the game is called Small Folk. In Definitive Edition, the opening cutscene is a pre-recorded movie file, but in all other versions of the game, this opening sequence is rendered in-game. This is likely because the Bionis and Mechonis models used in the intro were vastly more detailed in the Switch version, and the Switch couldn't render so many complex models at one time at an acceptable frame rate. In Definitive Edition, the entirety of the ending cutscene is in-engine, but on the Wii and new 3DS, the ending was pre-rendered when in the town part of Colony 9, due to how many high-resolution, fully animated characters were on screen at once. The Wii and new 3DS certainly could not handle that. Believe it or not, Adam Howden, voice of Shulk, posted a screenshot of the assets that were used to help him dub Definitive Edition's bonus epilogue, Future Connected. This was a debugging build of the game, and as a result, included some extra data the player is never normally able to see. The following info was included. This is our best guess as to what it says. VS is the prefix used for the game's cutscenes. The camera location is likely coordinates, and the player position is 0 because the player is not actually in-game at this time. The Shulk on the screen is a cutscene object. Zord, the first faced Mechon you fight, is heavily implied to have a daughter, Desiree. After you beat Zord, she explains that her father ran a smithy called Zord Smithy and was a blacksmith, but he died in the battle with the Mechon a year ago. The Japan-only Xenoblade The Secret Files art book not only confirms that Desiree is indeed Zord's daughter, but that Zord was the faced Mechon that saved Juju and Otheron. The book goes on to specify that Zord's brain was implanted into Mysterious Face's body, but only a selection of brain stems and vital organs were implanted, which is why Zord has memory loss. One small attention to detail is that the clothes characters wear are retained in flashbacks of that scene. For instance, if you have Shulk wear the glasses when he breaks the Monado's chains on Prison Island, whenever that exact scene is shown again, Shulk will also be wearing glasses. The game's localizers also had their impact on the game. Have you ever wondered why most of faced Mechons have names corresponding to their colors, but metal-faced is not? We have Green Face, Gold Face, and Zord was called Brown Face before his name was officially revealed. Well, Metal Face does have a name with a color, but he was renamed for the English localization. His Japanese name directly references his black paint coat, and as such, you can easily infer why this name was altered for English-speaking audiences. The game uses many tricks to show dramatic angles for cutscenes. For instance, in this clip when Shulk first touches the Monado in Colony 9, you can see that Shulk's head is bent back to show this specific camera angle of Shulk reaching for the Monado. Another interesting fact is that all the character models in Xenoblade Chronicles share the same bone structure, including all Nopon, even the bestest of them. This makes it easy to swap in different animations for character models. Here's Ricky's model playing Zanza's animations. Did you also know that Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire were originally planned as reboots, but the idea was scrapped? Or that Miyamoto originally hated Wind Waker's art style? For more facts, check out our videos on Pokémon Gen 3 and the Wind Waker. Special thanks to RoboTortoise for researching and writing the bulk of this video, as well as Gamemaniac, Hiccup, J-Dur, PT Piranha, and Ultima Shadow X for their contributions. And thank you for watching. See you next time!